The letter arrived on the same morning Phoebe Khan buried her press. Not the press itself, that was too heavy to move and too valuable to destroy, but the name above the door. Khan and husband, printers, established 1841. She had painted over it herself one grey November morning, 2 years after Edmund Khan had gone into the ground. She had painted Khan & Co. in its place because she had no husband to put on the sign and no son old enough to hold a brush, and because the men who brought paper and the men who collected debts needed to believe there was someone behind her worth dealing with. The letter came while she was setting type. Her son Pip, 6 years old and inclined toward accidents, brought it in from the front step and set it on the composing stone without looking at what he was standing on, which was the letter P, 16 of them, which she had spent the last quarter hour laying out by hand. She looked at the seal. She did not recognize it. She opened it anyway, Mrs. Khan. I am told you are the finest printer between Exeter and the Cornwall border. I require discretion, speed and accuracy. I require them now. My secretary will call at 4 o'clock. Ashby, Tremayne. Phoebe set the letter down on the composing stone next to the ruined P's. Ashby, Tremayne. She turned the name over the way. She turned a piece of type in her fingers, looking for the nick, the flaw, the side that would print clean. Tremayne House stood 4 miles above the village on the coast road. She had never been there. Most people in Turn Bay hadn't. The Earl of Ashby had been in London for the better part of 3 years. His mother had died in the spring. His younger brother, she had heard at the market, had come to stay in September and had not yet left. She did not know which of the two had sent the letter. She picked up the broken peas and started again. The secretary came at 4. He was a small man in a very correct coat, and he spoke the way people spoke when they had been instructed to say as little as possible. He said the Earl required documents printed and bound before the end of the week. He said there were 12 in total. He set the handwritten originals on her counter and said she would be paid double her rate for speed and triple for discretion. She looked at the originals. They were legal documents, property transfers, all of them. Everyone moved some portion of the Tremayne estate out of the Earl's name and into a trust administered by. She read the line twice. The Earl's brother, one Mr. Fletcher Ashby. She looked up at the secretary. He looked back at her with the face of a man who had been told to look at nothing. The Earl himself, she said. Is he well enough to sign these? The secretary said. He is well enough. She said, I'll need him to say so. The secretary said, Madam, the Earl does not come to printers. Phoebe said, then he does not get his documents by Friday. There was a silence. Outside, the harbour bell rang the quarter hour. Pip knocked something over in the back room and caught it before it fell. The secretary left. He came back at 6 with a carriage. The coast road to Tremayne House was 4 miles of chalk and flint, and the sound of the sea somewhere below in the dark. Phoebe had been on it once before, in a dog-cart, the winter after Edmund died, when she had gone to deliver a bill of sale to the old Earl's steward and had turned back at the gate because no one had answered the bell. She had not tried again. The house, when the carriage pulled up, was larger than she had expected and darker than it needed to be. Lights in 3 windows, all of them on the upper floor. The rest of the front was black. The housekeeper, a stout woman who did not offer her name, led her through a hall that smelled of damp and beeswax, and up a staircase that went left where she expected it to go right. There was a draught from somewhere. The lamp the housekeeper carried made the shadows move on the plasterwork. The door she was brought to was at the end of a long passage. Inside, the room was warm. Too warm for a man who was well. There was a fire built high and a window sealed against the November air. The bed was a heavy thing, curtained in blue wool, and the man in it was sitting up against the bolsters, in the manner of a man who had just made himself do so, and was not sure how long he could hold it. Phoebe had been a printer's wife for 7 years. She had delivered invoices to the sick and the dying and the merely inconvenient. She was not easily moved. She was somewhat moved. The Earl of Ashby was perhaps 32. He had a face that would have been good-looking in health, and in illness was still striking, the way ruins were striking. The structure held even when everything else had gone. His hands on the coverlet were too thin. The skin at his temples was the colour of old paper. His eyes, which were dark, were more awake than the rest of him. Mrs. Khan, he said. His voice was clear. Whatever was wrong with him had not touched the voice. "My lord," she said. She stood at the foot of the bed. She did not sit, she had not been invited to sit, and she did not apologize for coming. "I wanted to confirm that you are aware of what your secretary has brought me to print." He looked at her. "Property transfers, 12 of them, moving the whole of the home estate into a trust administered by your brother. Yes, you have read them. I drew them up." She studied his face. His eyes did not waver. "You are not being coerced." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. "I am being asked that question by my printer. You are being asked it by the woman who will put her name on the presswork. If those documents are later called in question, my press is part of the record, so... Are you being coerced?" A pause. The fire settled. "No," he said. "I am being practical." She looked at the room, at the sealed window, at the untouched tray on the table beside the bed, broth gone cold, bread pulled apart at the edge and no further. "You are ill," she said. "I have been ill 6 weeks. What does your physician say?" "My physician," he said, "says rest and quiet and time." She did not say what she was thinking, which was that a man did not transfer his entire estate to his brother because his physician had told him to rest. She said, "I will need 3 days, and I will need the originals back when the printing is done. The originals stay here. Then I keep a copy of each for my records." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because if anyone ever asks what I printed and when and on whose instruction, I want the answer in my files and not in my memory." This time the thing at the corner of his mouth was definitely a smile, though it was tired. "You are not what I expected. What did you expect?" "Someone who would take the money and not ask questions." "I will take the money," she said. "I always ask questions." She picked up her bag. "Send the originals to the shop by 9 tomorrow. I will have proofs by Wednesday." She went to the door. "Mrs. Khan," she turned. He had let his head go back against the bolster. He was looking at the ceiling with the look of a man who was calculating how long before he needed to admit something. "Have you someone who can stay at the shop if you are called away?" She looked at him. "Why would I be called away? I don't know that you would." She waited. He said, "My brother is a careful man. He will want to know who I've dealt with." He said it flat, to the ceiling, with the precision of a man who had been thinking about it a long time. "I want you to know that before you leave." Phoebe stood at the door with her hand on the frame and thought of Pip in the back room, standing on the letter P. She said, "I'll see the documents are done by Friday." She went. The originals arrived at 9. She set Pip to schoolwork at the back table and read every page before she touched the press. She read them 3 times. They were legal. They were precise. They moved the estate intact to the brothers' trust, with a clause restoring it to the Earl on his full recovery, or, should he not recover, passing it to the eldest child of the next legitimate line, which was. She read the clause 4 times, not the brother at all, but a distant cousin in Edinburgh. She thought about that clause for a long time. She thought, a man being coerced does not build in a clause that disenhides his coercer on the coercer's own account. She thought, a man who knows he is being slowly killed might. She set the first page in the composing frame and began. On Wednesday, she brought the proofs herself. She had not been asked to. She told the housekeeper she needed the Earl to review them for errors, which was true, and which was also not the only reason she had come. He was sitting up in the chair by the window when she was shown in. He had been dressed, shirt, waistcoat, no coat, and the effort of it was visible in the set of his jaw. The window was still sealed, the fire was still too high. The tray beside the chair held a cup that was 3/4 full and had been full since morning by the ring on the saucer. She set the proofs on the table. He picked up the first page. His eyes moved across it steadily. She stood at the fire and looked at the cup. "You haven't eaten," she said. "The broth is cold. It was cold when they brought it, probably." She picked up the cup. The smell was not right. She was not a physician. She was the daughter of a courthouse clerk who had spent 40 years watching what people did with documents they meant to use against each other. And she was the wife of a man who had printed prescriptions for every apothecary from Turn Bay to Bodmin. And she knew the smell of laudanum in a liquid, as well as she knew the smell of ink. She set the cup down, she said carefully, "My lord, who brings your meals." He looked up from the proofs. He looked at her face. He looked at the cup. He said, "The kitchen maid." or my brother sometimes, when he is here." Phoebe sat down in the chair across from him without being invited. Her legs were not as steady as they had been. "I want to tell you something. I want you to hear it as a fact and not as an accusation." "Can you do that?" He set the proofs down. She told him what she smelled. She told him what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the difference was between suspicion and proof. She told him plainly, once, the way her father had told her things when they mattered. The room was very quiet when she finished. He looked at the cup for a long time. Then he said, "How long?" Not a question. The way a man said a thing when he already knew the answer and needed to hear someone else say it. "I don't know," she said. 6 weeks, you said. You have been ill 6 weeks. He shut his eyes. He opened them. "The documents. The documents are nearly done. Will you finish them?" "Yes, and after?" She didn't answer. He didn't press her. He looked out the sealed window at the grey November sea. "I have a cousin in Edinburgh," he said. "I know. I read the clause." Another almost smile. "You read everything." "I'm a printer. That's the job." He looked at her then with the particular look of a man who is reassessing something he thought he had already settled. She let him look. She was 31 years old. She had been assessed by men in rooms for most of her professional life, and she had learned to let it happen without flinching and without changing. "Mrs. Khan," he said, "will you stay?" She thought of the shop, of Pip and the letter P, of the name she had painted over the door 2 years ago. "I will come back in the morning," she said. "I will bring the finished documents and I will bring my son, because I have no one to leave him with. I will look at every cup that comes into this room, and I will not tell your brother I am doing it. That is what I can do. That is more than I have any right to ask." "Yes," she said, "it is." She left. She drove back to Turn Bay in the last of the afternoon light. She collected Pip from his schoolwork, locked the front of the shop, and stood at the composing stone for a long while, with her hands flat on the cold metal. She thought, the brother wants the estate. The documents give him the estate temporarily and deny it to him permanently. He does not yet know about the Edinburgh clause. When he reads them, he will know. She thought, the documents need to be finished before he reads them. She thought, I have been a printer's widow for 2 years, and I know what men do with documents they find inconvenient. She set the next page in the composing frame. She worked until 2 in the morning. Pip slept on the settee in the back room under his coat. She finished the last document, pulled the proofs, checked every line by lamplight with a composing stick and her own exhausted eyes, and found 3 errors which she corrected, and then found a 4th, which was not an error in the printing, but an error in the original. A date written as the 9th that should have been the 19th, which changed the entire window for execution. She corrected it. She noted the correction in her records. She did not know if she was authorized to correct the Earl's own documents. She did it anyway. She wrapped the bound set in oilcloth and set it on the counter. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the cold press and listened to Pip breathe and thought about the smell of the cup. In the morning she took Pip and the documents and the dog cart and drove up the coast road. The brother was there. She had not seen him before. He was standing in the entrance hall when the housekeeper let her in, standing there as if he had been standing there for a while, in a good coat, with an easy posture, and a face that was pleasant in the way that certain contracts were pleasant. Clear language, nothing hidden, and every clause designed to benefit one party. "Mrs. Khan," he said. He had been told her name. She had not been told his. "Fletcher Ashby. I believe you've been doing some work for my brother." "I have," she said. He looked at the oilcloth package under her arm. Finished, nearly, which was not quite a lie. The printing was finished. The binding had one signature left to trim. He smiled. He had a good smile, the kind that arrived promptly and stayed a precise amount of time. "I'll take those up to him. Save you the trip. I need him to sign the proof sheet," she said. "Printer's record. He'll know what I mean." A pause. "Not long. Of course. Go on up." She went up. The Earl was in the chair again. He had the look of a man who had heard voices in the hall and had spent the last 3 minutes deciding what expression to have on his face. He settled on neutral when she came through the door. His eyes went to Pip, who had come in behind her, carrying the bound set with both hands, and a look of tremendous responsibility. "This is my son," Phoebe said. "He goes where I go." "Of course," the Earl said. He looked at Pip. "What's your name?" "Philip Edmund Carn," Pip said, with the formality of a child who had been asked this question often enough to have an answer ready. "But everyone calls me Pip, except my mother when I've done something." "And have you done something?" Pip considered. "Not today." Something in the Earl's face settled. Not relaxed. That was not the right word. Settled the way a foundation settled when weight was put on it properly. Phoebe took the bound set from Pip's arms. She set it on the table and opened it to the last page. She set a pen beside it. She said, "Before you sign, there is a note at the back. Page 14. I corrected a date. 9 to 19, check it." He turned to page 14. He read. He looked up at her. "Yes," he said. "That's right. I know. I also noticed that the correction changes the execution window to run past the quarter session." He was quiet. She said, "If the documents are executed before the quarter session, the Edinburgh clause has no mechanism for review. If they are executed after it stands," he said. "Yes." He looked at the pen. He looked at the page. He looked at her with the eyes that had been too awake for the rest of him since the first night. "You know what you've told me," he said. "I know what I've told you. If my brother reads the filing date, he will read what is printed. The filing date is not printed until you sign." He picked up the pen. He signed. He signed each page with a hand that was not as steady as it had been, and was steadier than Phoebe would have expected. And when he set the pen down the last time, he held himself very still for a moment, the way a man held himself after a decision that could not be taken back. Pip had found a book on the shelf by the window, and was sitting on the floor reading it. Neither of them had told him to sit on the floor. He had simply found the most convenient reading position, and assumed it. Phoebe gathered the signed pages. She said, "The documents will be filed Thursday morning. Mr. Pendry at the solicitor's office. He was my husband's account. He will file them correctly." "Your husband's account?" "Edmund Carn printed half the legal documents in this county for 30 years. I know every solicitor in Turn Bay, and I know which ones do what they are paid to do." She looked at him. "Mr. Pendry will file them. He will not mention my name, and he will not mention yours until Thursday noon, at which point the filing's complete and cannot be unfiled." The Earl looked at her. He said, "How much do I owe you?" She named her rate. Double, as agreed, for speed. She did not charge triple for discretion. She had decided, driving up the coast road in the morning light, that she would not accept triple for discretion. She was not sure she could explain why. She thought it had something to do with the Edinburgh clause. He looked at her rate on the paper she had written it on. He said, "You have undercharged me. I've charged you correctly. Mrs. Carn." "The documents are done," she said. "Sign the proof sheet and I will go." He signed the proof sheet. She took Pip and the proof sheet and left the bound originals on the table. In the hall, Fletcher Ashby was waiting. He was not standing in the middle of the hall this time. He was standing to one side, at the table where the morning's post was laid, holding a letter, holding it in the way of a man who has been reading it and has just heard footsteps on the stair. He looked at her. He looked at the proof sheet in her hand. "All done," he said. "All done," she said. He held the letter a moment longer. Then he smiled and set it on the table. "Marvellous. I'll see you out." He walked with her to the door. He was pleasant all the way to the step. He asked how long she had been in business. He asked if she had family in the area. He asked about her son with the particular attention of a man who was not interested in her son. At the door he said, "You'll send the account to the house?" "The account is settled," she said. He looked at her. The pleasant expression did not change. That was how she knew he had already decided something, because a person whose expression needed to change would have let it change. "Well then," he said. "Safe travels, Mrs. Carn." She put Pip in the dog-cart and drove back down the coast road. She drove 2 miles before her hands stopped being cold. She drove the 3rd mile thinking about the letter he had been holding. She had not been able to read it. She had seen the handwriting on the outside, which was not the Earl's. She had seen the broken seal, which had been opened in a hurry. She thought, "He knows about the Edinburgh clause." Not from the documents. Those were upstairs and still unsigned when he met her in the hall. But someone had written to him about it. She thought, the only person who would write to him about it was the Edinburgh cousin whom she had not contacted. or the solicitor whom she had not yet contacted, or someone in the household who had read the documents before she arrived. She thought she was the printer. She had the documents. She pulled the dog cart to the side of the road. She sat for a moment. The sea was below to the left, grey and flat. Pip was eating a piece of bread he had extracted from somewhere, and looking at the sea with the serene attention of a child who trusted completely that the adults around him knew what they were doing. She thought, I am the only one who knows about the Edinburgh clause and the filing date. The Earl had not told him. I had not told him. He had read it somewhere. She thought, the documents I left this morning were signed. The documents from Wednesday's proofs were in my shop. She thought, the shop. She turned the dog cart around. She drove back to Turn Bay at a pace that alarmed Pip and interested the horse. She came into the back of the shop through the kitchen door. The front was still locked. The proofs were still on the composing stone. And on the floor by the counter, face down, was the spare set she had printed for her records. She had locked it in the flat file drawer. The drawer was open. She picked up the spare set. She went through every page. Every page was there. The Edinburgh clause was on page 7, with her correction penciled in the margin in her own hand. Anyone who could read a legal document would have understood it in 30 seconds. She sat down on the stool by the press. She thought, he has been here, or someone he sent has been here, while I was on the road. She thought, the filing is Thursday. Today is Wednesday. She thought, I have to be faster than he is. She went to the writing desk. She wrote to Mr. Pendry. She did not explain the situation. She wrote 4 sentences. The documents were ready for filing. She needed them filed first thing. Thursday, she would deliver them that evening. She would explain in person. She sealed it. She gave it to the boy who ran errands for the chandler next door and told him to have it at the solicitor's by 5. Then she went upstairs and packed a bag for Pip. She brought him to her neighbour, Mrs. Crews, who was 64 and reliably incurious, and told her she had a job out of town and would be back by Friday. Mrs. Crews took Pip in with the ease of a woman who had raised 5 children and found one more unremarkable. Pip asked if he could bring the book from the Earl's shelf. Phoebe said she would get him a book from the shop. He considered whether this was an acceptable trade and decided it was. She went back to the shop. She took the proof set and the spare and put both in the satchel she carried when she delivered work. She locked the flat file drawer. She looked at the composing stone, at the press, at the sign over the door she had painted herself. She thought of Edmund, who had gone into the ground with 50 outstanding accounts and 3 half-finished commissions, and who had never, not once, been dishonest in the work. She picked up the satchel. She drove to Mr. Pendry's. He was 60, recently widowed, and the most careful man she had ever watched handle a document. He read the proof set twice. He read the spare once. He read the Edinburgh clause 3 times and then set his glasses on top of his head and said, Mrs. Carn, I need you to tell me everything. She told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had always valued in him. When she was done, he said, The brother has seen this. I believe so. He will move to have the documents challenged before filing. I know, on what grounds, his brother's capacity. He has been ill 6 weeks. There is, I suspect, a reason he has been ill 6 weeks. Mr. Pendry looked at her over his glasses for a long moment. That is an accusation. That is a suspicion. I want the documents filed before it becomes either one. He filed them that evening. He stayed past his usual hour and filed them himself with the clerk of the district court. And he collected the time-stamped receipt in his own hands, and he brought it to Phoebe in the waiting room and put it in her hands without speaking. She read the time-stamp. She let out a breath she had been holding, she thought, since Wednesday noon. Thursday morning, Fletcher Ashby arrived at the solicitor's office with a letter from a physician in Truro and a petition for a review of his brother's capacity. Mr. Pendry received him. Mr. Pendry said, very politely, that the documents had been filed at 6:47 the previous evening, and that the receipt was time-stamped and witnessed, and that any petition for review would need to address itself to the court, and not to the solicitor, who had merely done his client's clear and witnessed instruction. Mr. Pendry reported this to Phoebe afterward, word for word, with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting 30 years for a situation that called for exactly that sentence. She drove up to Tremayne House that afternoon. She had not been asked. She brought no documents. She brought a covered pot of broth she had made at 6 in the morning, because she had not slept and needed something to do with her hands, and because she had thought about the cold cup on the tray and found she could not think of anything else. The housekeeper let her in. The housekeeper looked at the pot and did not ask. The Earl was in the chair by the window. The window was open 2 inches. That was different from before. She set the pot on the table. She said the documents were filed last night. He looked at her. She said, "Your brother attempted a challenge morning, Mr. Pendry has the time-stamped receipt." He said nothing for a long while. Then he said, "The window, I opened it this morning." She looked at the 2 inches of grey November sea and sky. "Good, first time in 6 weeks." He looked at it. "It is extremely cold. Yes, I find I don't mind." She sat down without being invited. She felt, suddenly, the full weight of the 2 days, the sleepless night at the press, the drive at speed, the afternoon at Mr. Pendry's, the drive back. She felt it in her legs and in the place between her shoulder blades where one's back ached after too many hours at a composing stone. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask the cup, the broth, the tea, whatever they brought you." "How long?" He looked at the sealed tray from the morning. Different tray, same cup, still 3/4 full. "I stopped drinking what they brought 2 days ago. 2 days. After you left on Wednesday, I told the kitchen maid I wasn't hungry." He looked at the window. "I have been very hungry." She uncovered the pot. She poured a cup, her own cup, from the satchel which she brought with her, because the apothecary's wife in Turn Bay had told her once that a woman who worked in other people's houses was a fool to drink from their cups. She handed it to him. He drank it. He drank it slowly, the way a man drank who had been ill and was trying not to rush. She watched him. She was not being polite by watching. She was being a printer's daughter who had spent her life watching people with documents. And a printer's wife who had spent 7 years watching who handled what with whose hands. And a printer's widow who had learned that the most important thing in any document was not the language but the date. He finished the cup. He held it in both hands. "My brother," he said, "has gone. Mr. Pendry told me he left the office at 9:30. The housekeeper says he took his trunk. He looked at the cup. "I don't know whether to be sorry." She thought about the word sorry. She thought about what it meant to grieve a person who had tried to do you harm, because the person had been a brother first and a danger second. She had some experience with grief at a distance, with mourning things that were not entirely what they had seemed. She said, "You can be both." He looked at her. She said, "Sorry and not sorry. At the same time, it doesn't have to resolve." He was quiet. Then he said, "You said that like someone who has had practice." "My husband was a good man," she said. "He was also a careless one sometimes, in the way that certain good men are careless. I am sorry he is gone, and I am also sorry about the 50 outstanding accounts and the 3 half-finished commissions. Both are true." He looked at her with the look she was beginning to recognize, the look of a man reassessing something he thought he already knew. "Mrs. Khan," he said, "your name will be on the filing, I know. If my brother decides to make this difficult, he will make it difficult through the courts," she said. "Where documents live, I am a printer. Documents are my home territory." That was definitively a smile. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was the smile of a man who had not smiled in a long time and was surprised to find the mechanism still worked. She stood. She picked up the empty cup. She looked around the room, at the open window, at the lower fire, at the tray that had not been touched. "Eat something," she said. "Not from that tray. What do I eat from? I'll speak to the housekeeper on my way out." She picked up the satchel. "I'll be back Friday with the receipts. You'll want the full set for your files, Mrs. Khan." She turned. He had both hands on the arms of the chair, steadying himself, or simply feeling the solidity of something. "What is your son's name, his full name?" "Philip Edmund Khan," she said. "He goes by Pip." He nodded. "He took a book from my shelf." She stopped. "I know. I told him he couldn't. It's a book about lighthouses," he said. "I have not opened it since I was 12. I would like him to have it." He paused. "If you'll allow it." She stood at the door with her hand on the frame. "That depends on whether he returns it." "He needn't. He will anyway," she said. "That's how I've raised him." She went. 6 months passed and then another 6. In that time, Phoebe learned the road between Turn Bay and Tremayne House in all its weathers. She had not intended to learn it. She had intended to deliver the Friday receipts and return to the press and the compositing stone, and the name over the door and the 50 accounts that were not outstanding anymore, because she had settled them in the year after Edmund died, one by one, with the same patience she used to set type. But the Friday receipts led to a question about the Cornwall quarterly proceedings, which the Earl subscribed to, and which had arrived misprinted for 3 months running. And the question about the misprinting led to an inquiry about the firm that supplied him with printed correspondence, which led to a contract, and the contract led, by a natural series of steps that Phoebe could trace clearly in retrospect, and had not seen clearly at all as they were happening, to a standing arrangement in which Carn & Co. was the printer of record for Tremayne House. She told herself this was business. She told herself this twice a week for 4 months, and then she stopped telling herself and simply drove up the coast road on Tuesdays and Fridays and answered the question she was usually asked, which was not always about printing. The Earl, she had begun to think of him, privately, as Callum, which was his given name, and which she used in her head only because the alternative was the Earl, which began to feel imprecise, recovered his health by degrees. He ate. He opened the window further. He came downstairs in January for the first time. He walked the cliff path in February slowly, and reported to her on Friday that the east view was clear. She said the east view was always clear in February. He said he had forgotten. He said it in the way of a man who had been inside for a long time, and was discovering that the world had not, after all, stopped while he was away. She said nothing to that. She was proofreading a run of correspondence, and her eye was on the 3rd line. She had learned not to look up when he said something she could not improve on. Fletcher Ashby did not attempt another legal challenge. The case was referred to the district court in March, heard in May, and settled without spectacle. The Edinburgh cousin, a small, very dry man named Cavendish, who arrived by coach and shook Phoebe's hand as if she were a colleague, reviewed the documents and confirmed the clause. The brothers' petition was dismissed, the estate reverted, the solicitor filed a supplementary record. Phoebe printed the final binding. It was a Tuesday in the following June when Pip announced, at the kitchen table in the flat above the shop, that he could not find his lighthouse book. He had read it 11 times. She knew this because he had told her, and because she had found it in 6 different locations around the shop, including once inside the press, which was a conversation she had not enjoyed. She said, "When did you last see it?" He said, "At Tremayne," she said. "Pip," he said, "I didn't leave it there on purpose." She looked at him. He looked at her with the face of a child who was telling the truth about the accident, and somewhat less than the truth about the purpose. She said, "We'll get it Friday," he said. "Can we go tomorrow?" she said. "It's Wednesday," he said. "I know." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with his father's eyes and his own stubbornness, which was not his father's, and which she had long since stopped trying to identify the source of. She went on Wednesday. The Earl was in the library. He had been in the library a great deal lately. He had started buying books again, he said, which was a habit he had let go when things were. He used the word difficult. He meant 6 months ago, which was already a long time and not very long at all. The lighthouse book was on the reading table. Pip found it immediately and held it against his chest. Phoebe looked at the book on the reading table. She looked at the Earl across the table. She said, "He left it here." "I know," he said. "I put it out on Fridays in case you came." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the eyes that had been awake since the first night, and which were, she had found over the last year, most reliably awake when she was in the room. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "Not here," he said. "In front of Pip." She looked at Pip, who had opened the lighthouse book to page 12, and was already 2 miles away. She looked at the Earl. He had come around the reading table. He was standing a careful and deliberate distance from her, which she recognised as a distance that had been chosen with some thought. He said, "I know what I am asking. I know what it costs. I know you have a name over your door and a press and an account book, and a son who reads in inconvenient places." She said, "That is not a question." "I know," he said. "I'm coming to it." A pause. She had noticed, learned to pause in the year. He had been a man who spoke straight through when she met him. Now he stopped at the edge of things and looked first. "I want to ask if you will consider staying, not as my printer, I want to say the word right. Say it." He said it. Pip turned a page without looking up. Phoebe stood at the reading table with the proof of the quarterly correspondence in her satchel, and the smell of ink on her left hand where she had caught the press this morning, and she thought of Edmund, who had been good and careless, and she thought of the name over the door, which she had painted herself, and she thought of the morning she had driven up the coast road at speed with a 6-year-old in a dog-cart and a satchel full of other people's secrets, and how she had not known, going up, that it was the road she was going to learn by heart. She said, "Carn & Co. Stays," he said. "Yes," she said. "Pip stays." He said, "Obviously." She said, "The name over the door stays." He said, "I'll have them put it on the gatehouse if you like." She looked at him. He looked at her. Pip was on page 14. She said yes. A year after that, on a Friday that was mild for November, and had a low sun coming in off the sea, in a way that lit the whole west face of the library gold, Phoebe walked the cliff path for the first time. She had meant to walk it in September. She had said she would walk it in September, and then October had been busy and November had arrived, and the Earl— "Callum," she said now, in her head and sometimes in the room, in the way you said a name when it had finally become the right size for the person, had not asked her about it since she mentioned it in the summer. He did not ask. That was something she had come to understand about him, gradually, the way you understood a piece of type by handling it. He did not ask twice. He made room and he waited. She told him on Friday morning that she was going to walk the path. He said, "Now," she said, "after the quarterly correspondence, I have 3 pages to check." She checked the 3 pages. She found one transposition on page 2 which she corrected. She gave the pages to the housekeeper. She got her coat. Pip was doing his lessons at the library table, which had become his preferred location for lessons, since it had also become his preferred location for everything else. He looked up when she came through with her coat on. "The path," he said. "The path," she said. He went back to his lessons. He had grown up in a house where she left for reasons and came back. He did not make it larger than it was. She loved him for that, among other things. The coast path from the Tremayne gate was cut into the cliff and ran south for 2 miles before it turned inland. There was a place a 1/4 mile out where the chalk gave way to flint, and the sea opened up to the full horizon, and there was nothing between you and the line of it but air. She had not been to that place. She had been to the gate. She had stood at the gate on a Saturday in September when the morning was clear and thought, "Not yet," and gone back inside. She went now. The November light was flat and bright. The sea below was grey-green and moving and very far down. Her left hand was on the cut chalk wall at the path's inland edge. Her feet knew chalk from growing up near it. She walked. At the 1/4 mile mark, the chalk gave way and the view opened. She stopped. She stood at the edge of the cliff with the wind coming up from the sea and looked at the horizon for a long time. She thought of Edmund on the last morning she had seen him, which was an ordinary morning, which was how last mornings usually went. She thought of the press and the name over the door, and Pip at 6 asking her what widow meant, because he had heard someone at the market use it about her. She thought of the kitchen table where she had cried twice after Edmund died. Only twice, because there had been accounts to settle. And the composing stone, where she had been standing when the letter arrived, and the face of the man who had been in the chair by the sealed window. She thought, "I drove up a road in the dark because someone needed a printer," she thought. "I stayed because I chose to." She put her hand to the chalk wall. It was cold and dry and solid, she said quietly, to the horizon and the sea and Edmund's ordinary last morning. "You would have liked him. He reads everything twice, and he never fixes a comma without asking first." She did not cry. She turned. She walked back. At the gate, Callum was waiting. He had a coat on, and Pip at his side and the courtesy not to ask. She came through the gate. She took his offered hand. They walked back across the grounds together toward the house, where the lamps were coming on in the library windows against the early November dark. Behind them, the path ran south in the last of the light, chalk and flint, and the sound of the sea. The same path it had always been. She had not come to it the way she had come to most things, with a plan, with a contract, with 3 pages to check and 1 correction to make. She had come to it the way she had come to everything that mattered, because the road was there, and she had chosen to walk it, and she did not stop at the gate anymore.